private sector doing anything, and there's obviously some kind of centre ground, and we should look at the failings of this and try and improve things without being quite so ideological. There's been a lot of criticism of a number of things, and I think the debate's become conflated a large number of issues: privatisation, outsourcing, PFI, procurement. It's all sort of been lumped into one sort of private sector bad, public sector good argument. And the logical question for this, if we're sort of on the Labour side, which I'm not suggesting that Dame Margaret's going to be able to answer for the current leadership in this respect, is where does it all end? We use outsourcing at the taxpayers' allowance. Our employees are not required to clean the office at the end of the day. Are Labour seriously suggesting that there not going to be any outsourcing of basic things like cleaning and catering? But what are we doing wrong here? What are the problems with tendering processes? Are the incentives wrong for civil servants and ministers? Is there too much focus on price and not enough focus on sort of risk management, value for money, etc.? And the Taxpayers' Alliance takes the view that there's nothing inherently wrong with private provision of public services. There's nothing inherently wrong with PFI. In 2009, the NAO did a report which basically argued that 69% of PFI construction projects between 2003 and 2008 were delivered on time to the agreed specification and on budget, and that sounds rough. That sounds all right to me. Generally speaking, there's always room for improvement. So we don't have a problem with PFI, we don't really have a problem with outsourcing, but we do have a problem with the way in which this company has been given a number of contracts. For instance, in the Civil Service Strategic Supplier Risk Management Policy, it states that a strategic supplier should be deemed high risk if one of a number of criteria are met, one of which is the issue by the supplier or any guarantor of its obligations of a profits warning to a stock exchange. Now, this happened on 3 occasions. Yet Carillion was still given more contracts. And there's just one kind of little quote which I thought was quite interesting from Prime Minister's questions a couple of weeks ago, where in response to a question from Jeremy Corbyn about Carillion, Theresa May said, if the government pulled out of contracts, or indeed large private sector companies pulled out of contracts whenever a profit warning was issued, that would be the best way to ensure that companies failed and jobs were lost. Now, that doesn't particularly strike me as the best way to protect taxpayers in this. Are these contracts being given to keep companies afloat as opposed to sort of the efficient and value for money delivery of public services and infrastructure? But I'll leave that as an open question and introduce our panel. From my right, we've got Ian McGill, who is the founder and MD of OpenOps.com, which publishes masses of information from across the world about government tendering opportunities. Ian spent 20 years in public procurement, including as a management consultant specialising in this very area. And he also wrote this piece on Coffee House, The Spectator, titled "Carillion's Collapse is the Worst of All Worlds for the Government." So he's obviously got some strong opinions about this. And to my immediate right, we've got Dame Margaret Hodge, Member of Parliament for Barking since 1994. Margaret was a minister at the Departments of Education, Work and Pensions, and Culture, Media and Sport before it got the digital bit. She also chaired the Public Accounts Committee between 2010 and 2015, so she's got plenty of experience grilling bosses of companies. She also released this book last year called Called to Account, How Corporate Bad Behaviour and Government Waste Combine to Cost Millions. And I think millions was probably a little bit on the optimistic side there. To my immediate left is Juliet Samuel. Juliet studied at Harvard and has been a journalist for a number of very sound publications, including Guido Fawkes, City, The Times, the Wall Street Journal, which was recently described to me as the business newspaper that doesn't hate its readers. She's currently a columnist at The Telegraph, where she writes mostly about sort of finance, economics, business, and obviously Brexit quite a lot nowadays. And then on my far left, we've got Dan Lewis, who is Senior Advisor at the Institute of Directors on Infrastructure Policy. Dan spends more than 10 years in the public policy world. He regularly meets and engages with IOD members on issues regarding specifically infrastructure and energy policies. And in a previous life, he worked in banking, asset management, and corporate treasury in both London and Luxembourg. So I think I'm going to ask Ian to kick off first, and I'll ask each speaker to speak for 5 or 6 minutes, less if you feel that way. If you stand as you please.
I have no idea what it is. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me all?
Yeah.
Right, thank you. I'll start by just saying a couple of sentences about what we do, which will explain why I'm here. You won't have heard of me. So we're responsible for, at OpenOps.com, we're responsible for gathering literally hundreds of millions of lines of procurement data from the UK particularly, but all around the world, in order to try and understand what is happening with government procurement and to get a sense of where money is being most effectively spent and where it is perhaps not being spent in the best way. We do this using openly available data. I don't know if any of you remember in 2010, the Prime Minister wrote to, David Cameron as Prime Minister wrote to councils and to government departments insisting that they start publishing details of what they were spending their money on. And since then we've been hoovering up all this data and trying to make sense of it, which has not been a very easy thing to do. What we have known and what we have been able to do is we've been able to see what I can only call a creeping consolidation in our market. And this is a fundamental failing, effectively, that we are allowing our public procurement market to become less and less competitive. We spend, by the Crown Commercial Services estimate, £250 billion a year with third-party providers, whether that's someone in Margaret's constituency providing food for a Jewish food festival once a year, through to the likes of Carillion. All of that money gets it totaled up to around 250 billion. So on the scale of Brexit, this isn't, it's not the biggest thing, but it is actually a really important part of our economy. And actually, one of the problems that we're seeing when we look at the data is that more and more money is going to fewer and fewer suppliers. And these suppliers are not necessarily delivering the best outcomes for the government and for the public. And in fact, what we're finding is that there's a manipulation of the rules, or rather a manipulation of the process that favours the incumbent. And the incumbents are persistently winning more and more business. We talked about, Alex mentioned the fact that Carillion had some outsourcing, and so it had some profit warnings. Well, there's a major outsourcer in the form of Capita that's also had profit warnings. We look at the spend of over 300 organisations, and we can find only 3 that have no spend with Capita. If you think Carillion was bad, if Capita went to the wall, there would be some serious problems to consider. And what we're not doing as a nation is we're not looking from above at the exposure we have to these companies and whether our systems are creating competitive tenders. In Europe, across Europe, and this is not just the UK, we're seeing tenders have the number of tenders with only one bidder, which is always a worry, has increased to nearly 30%. So we know that this is an issue. And before anyone says, well, look, this is the European regulations, we're seeing the same problems on smaller tenders at sub-ODRU level. So below the limit for European tenders, we're seeing the same problems. So what can we do about this? Well, one of the things that people might have noticed about following Carillion is that no one really knew how many contracts they had. And one of the, and this is, you can go to Contracts Finder, the central portal where all of the data is supposed to be, and you can find just 28 references to Carillion instead of 450. Now, we cannot consider ourselves a normal, highly functioning, economically viable society if we cannot know where the contracts of our governments are. If we cannot know where our public bodies are spending money on our behalf, we're missing out. In Slovakia, if you publish a public if you fail to publish a public contract, that contract becomes invalid. It's very simple. We have the ability, we have the mechanization to analyze all of this data pretty much instantly. And actually what we're letting ourselves down with is the failure to publish it and the failure to make it analyzable. So my belief is that actually we can skip past a lot of the dogma related to whether public is good and private is bad, simply by making good information available about these contracts and then monitoring the progress of them. And actually that might require a bit more investment at some level to make the data available, but it should solve a lot of these problems. So that's my position. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. Dame Margaret.
Right, do you want to sort of go there? Shall I go from here?
Whatever you want.
Is that all right with you? Yeah, good. Right, I'm going to try. I think I might go over a little bit. I'm really sorry, but I will try and keep it as tight as I can. First of all, well done to Taxpayers Alliance, because it's great to see so many people. It's a bit sad that it took Carillion to excite everybody. This is a hugely important issue. Just to build a bit on what Ian said, if you take out transfer payments out of public expenditure, the 700 billion pounds of money that we spend, taxpayers' money that we spend, take out things like pensions, benefits, all that, and just look at services, over half of the services that are now provided from the taxpayers' pound are provided through mainly the private sector, a tiny bit through the voluntary sector, but mainly through the private sector. So it's hugely important. There's been an incredible growth, a sort of 500% growth in the companies that are playing in this public sector field. They now constitute about 7% of GDP, so you're talking big numbers, and they employ probably around 6 million people. So we're talking a big thing. And the contracts with government, if you look at these big companies that Ian was talking about, they are a huge amount of their business. For Carillion, it was about 40%. When we looked at Serco about 2 or 3 years ago, it was 2/3 of Serco's income came from public contracts. And you look at the other big G4Ss, Capita, people like that, it's about 1/3. And the money they get from the government now, or from the public sector, is larger, is greater in volume than the budgets of quite a lot of government departments. So we're talking about a huge thing. Now, I agree about the distinction that Alex made about PFI and outsourcing. And I don't know if you want me to talk about the entire, or shall I leave that?
Well, I think Carillion is looked at as about 6% of its revenues were from PFI, around bits in Canada, I think around a fifth, and the remainder in the UK. But I think it's relevant, so
Okay.
if you wish.
All right. Well, I take a different view on PFI from what I do for an outsourcing. Now, I like to think, it's quite a funny story this, but I started my life in local government. And we were operating in the time of Margaret Thatcher, when they were cutting back on public expenditure. And I had a huge housing capital programme in the borough that I was leader of. We were desperate to keep it going. And I think we invented PFI. And I still look at the housing in that borough, and it was actually, the investment was worthwhile. But I've changed my view. I have come to a different view on PFI. If you look again at PFI, we've got about 700 PFI projects in the country now. Their value is about 80 billion. But by the time we've paid back the money that we will do in the interest payments over the next, into the 2040s, we will have paid 200 billion. Actually, according to the NAO, 199 to be exactly, but 200 billion. I think that's hugely expensive. And if you actually look at I think the thing that really convinced me, under Labour we did a big, hospital capital programme, and we thought we needed it at the time. But it's locked us into that because the first call on the budget of any hospital, any health authority, is now to pay the interest, to pay the money on the PFI. Before they pay for a doctor or a nurse, they've got to pay their PFI charges. And we're now trying to get out of these big hospitals. We're trying to deliver health services in the community, and we're just locked into this inappropriate contract. And there's a very good example the LEO discovered at a school in Liverpool that they actually closed for some reason or other, but they're still going to be paying the PFI charges on that school for another 20 years or so. So I think that lack of flexibility is important. And I think most of the work done on costs is it's questionable whether it was cheaper, because there are additional costs from PFI. The PFI companies have to borrow on the open market. That costs them more than the government can borrow. And also there's cost all the advisors, setting up the special vehicles, all that sort of stuff. And even on the management of services the evidence doesn't suggest it's very good. So I think if we want to build infrastructure programs, we should build them out of top of the budget, we should build them out of the budget, the monies that are available, not hide it by spending a little today and then having future generations saddled with the debt arises from it. That's my view on PFI. On outsourcing, I'm different. Outsourcing has become a political football, and I regret that. You've got the right who talk about cutting the size of the state. The private sector is always better, it's always cheaper, it's more efficient. So private good, public bad. And you've got the left who simply talk about anything that's private is absolutely terrible, and everything ought to be delivered by the public. I take a different view, and I think this is the view we should take. When you think about how you deliver public services, you should put the citizen at the heart of what you want to do. And what works best for the citizen ought to then tell you how you're going to deliver it. So, for example, if I want to go and have a flu jab, which I do, it's much more convenient to me to go to the local chemist than to wait for an appointment with a GP. Or if it's a person trying to get a job, somebody with mental health challenges who's been out of the labour market for years and years and years, finally gets an interview, you want to buy them a suit. It might be much easier for a private company to do that in the interests of the unemployed person, and not have the telegraph and the mail all over you saying, what is Job Centre Plus doing spending public money on the suit? So there are instances where it makes sense. Equally, think about the hospital ward. And if you have your cleaners working to one private boss and you have the rest of the staff working to the NHS Trust, getting that group of people working as a team is very difficult. And in the interests of the patients, it would be much better if the person who serves the food and does the cleaning is part of that team, controlled by the matron in the ward. So always put the citizen at the heart of what you do. Labour's view, I think, puts the producer at the heart of what you do, and that's why I don't like it. So it's always whilst we want to have good working conditions, it should be the citizen, not the producer. That's the sort of current labour regime with which I disagree. But don't think that the private sector does better. In my years on the Public Accounts Committee, we looked at endless contracts where you could be as critical of lack of value for money from the private sector as you could from the public sector. Let me give you two examples, because we're tight on time. One is we looked at a contract in Cornwall, where Serco was delivering out-of-hour services for GPs, and basically they lied. An audit found that they had manipulated the data in 252 instances, lying about how quickly they answered the telephone, how quickly they got a doctor out to the patient. And when this was all uncovered by a whistleblower, their response was to rifle the lockers of all their staff to try and identify who the whistleblower was. And the reason Serco had got into this trouble was that they had got the contract by undercutting on price. And then they found they didn't have enough money in the contract to actually employ enough people. That's one example. The other is the Glasgow example. Again, it's a Serco and G4S example. Tagging in the Ministry of Justice. Do you remember that? When there was a contract that they were to tag prisoners who'd been let out into the community before their sentence had been expended. And The contract started in 2004. 2008, they had warnings about things going wrong. Nobody did anything about it. 2013, finally, whistleblowers uncovered that it was completely awful, and that the companies were claiming for people who'd left jail, who'd left prison and therefore didn't have to be tagged anymore, people who'd gone back to prison and therefore didn't need to be tagged either, and actually people who died. In the end, those companies paid £180 million back to the government, but I don't think we got our money back. So don't think the private sector is better. And I think quite often government does the mistake of privatising because they haven't got the management capability. It's a sort of putting off into the private sector, their inability to manage the public sector. My best example of that was a contract in the MOJ, where they were wanted to privatise a contract for interpreters in the courts, and they needed to save £18 million on the contract. They went out to tender, this little company got a contract, they did financial due diligence on the company, they were told not to give the company a contract of more than £1 million, they gave them one of £40 million, and on day one there were simply not enough interpreters in the courts. So lots of cases had to be delayed, justice was denied, extra costs to the system out of that. And when we interviewed them, the funniest story, and it's a bit apocryphal, but I love it, was that one of the, in giving evidence, it is said that one of the interpreters, who was so cross at the way this company was managing the contract, put in his cat as an expert on feline language. And that cat got through the whole system and was offered some work. So I think outsourcing is here to stay. It's just too big. I think it's unrealistic to say it's not there, and we've got to make it work better. And I would just say that I think there are 4 issues that we need to think about, and Carillion actually exemplifies many of them. One, if you want to play in the public sector market, you've got to be open and transparent. And if Carillion didn't hide behind commercial confidentiality, we might have seen the trouble they were in much, much earlier. And the National Audit Office ought to be able to go in there and do value for money exercises, and we ought to have freedom of information in there. And I think if you had transparency, you would deal with a lot. Second, the issue of the market. I agree. What we've done actually in this outsourcing is we've destroyed the market. We haven't created a market. We've actually destroyed it, because we've destroyed a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that have existed in my community, in Barking. I've seen it happen, that were very good at delivering public services, but they couldn't tender because of the absurd processes the government uses for tender, and they always hide behind European legislation, which I just think is a false excuse. I think European legislation can be very cumbersome, but you don't have to hide behind it and get the first. So I think we've got to change the way we tender, and it should be an objective of outsourcing actually to create diversity of providers. It's not. Third thing is skills. There are simply not the skills in the civil service to deal with today's world. If over half our public services are provided by third parties, you don't need policy wonks in the civil service. You need people who can manage projects, who've got commercial skills, IT skills, all those skills, negotiating skills, is what you need. And you just haven't got it. And it's not valued. It's not valued in the civil service. So if you really want to get on, you don't end up being involved in letting a contract, and you certainly don't end up in monitoring a contract. That's sort of bottom of the pile. And then you get moved on every couple of years, so when you're in the middle of a big tendering exercise, everybody loses the straight string. So I would go for massive recompetence. And then the final thing I would say is I think we need a new ethical framework and ethical standards, a sort of corporate governance view thing on this. And I put the sort of things I'm thinking about is don't lie. G for S, lied. These people in Serco down in Cornwall lied. And if you lie, you're off. You're not given anymore. None of us would use a shoddy builder again for another something else in our home. Why should the government do it? I think employment practices matter. What's happening in a lot of these is they're cutting the wages and of the people they employ because they're trying so hard to reduce the price. and you're seeing a lot of gig economy people working in public contracts, and you're seeing a lot of SMEs really cut to the bone. So I think there's got to be something about employment practices in there. You've got to be on the books, you've got to pay your PAYE and your national insurance, and maybe something around apprenticeships too. Pay your taxes, I would say that, but I think it's really important that if a private company seeking to make a profit out of your and my money, taxpayers' money, then chooses not to pay the taxes by the way they arrange their financial arrangements, they should just be off the books. It's unfair that they make money and then don't pay their fair dues. Be good about whistleblowers, and finally, and those sort of issues, don't do what Serco has done in Cornwall. And finally, I think you've got to have a public service ethos. We as citizens care about how people provide those public services to us. They've got to feel that they actually are committed to the service. And I think building that sort of ethical framework into the way in which we outsource companies, using the skills across private, voluntary and public sector to do so, is hugely important if we want the best services that all of us deserve. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Julia?
So I'm going to speak mainly about the construction industry in the context of Carillion, but probably a lot of what I would say might apply more broadly. And just first would be a quick point on PFI, which is that PFI, as done under the Blair government, had a lot of problems, but I don't think that we should throw out the idea entirely of the private sector resources funding construction. And the reason I say that is that there are in fact trillions of pounds of pension assets sitting right now in bonds with very low returns that would love to be invested in infrastructure assets that we need built, but aren't prepared to fund construction risk. And so if you were to have a program of rolling privatisation, whereby you could sell off assets that had been built, say, under outsourcing, to pension funds that want a steady income and can maintain them, you could actually unleash a lot of private sector cash in an efficient way into the construction that we need. But that's sort of an aside on private financing. So Carillion, now as Alex started out, we are having the wrong debate about Carillion. The bizarre thing about this company's collapse is that the immediate response to it was the questions that arose was, well, should the government have bailed Carillion out, and should taxpayers be paying bonuses and dividends to these shareholders? Ignoring the fact that, of course, Carillion wasn't bailed out, and shareholders and bondholders were, in fact, wiped out. And in fact, what you often have in the public sector are rolling bailouts that are sort of hidden, whereby projects overrun and the government then throws more money at them. But those are sort of invisible bailouts that we never see. And there's no reckoning and there's no sort of clear out of the bad practices because you simply have to keep the hospital running or whatever it is. And in fact, what Carillion is going through, the public money that is being spent, is more of what should be called a resolution procedure, where you wind up the company in an orderly way to ensure that schools don't close or prisons don't have to be shut down in the meantime. So the debate we're having is totally wrong, and particularly the debate about profit is totally wrong. So on the left, you've had a lot of voices talking about how the problem with that Carillion shows is that there's far too much profit being sucked out of the public sector by companies. And if only that had been true for Carillion's shareholders, because actually, of course, the problem was that it was not making enough profit. And the interesting thing about this is that this isn't just a one-off problem. The entire construction industry, not just in the UK, but globally, is suffering from a massive crunch on margins. And the average margin of the UK industry is now down to about 2%. So the problem here is too little profit. And what goes with too little profit? Well, a huge productivity crisis. So there's been no progress on construction productivity in the UK for about 15 years. It is the worst performing sector of the UK economy, far behind services and manufacturing. And in the US, construction productivity per labour unit is actually lower now than it was in 1968, which is absolutely astonishing. And what that also comes with is, this is a result of low investment. And so the problem that we're seeing across the construction industry, which the government is the biggest, they end up with a building that overruns, it doesn't function properly, it doesn't do what it's meant to do, and then the company collapses halfway through and you've got a huge problem. So the question is, how can the government run procurement in a way that actually gets value for money rather than just favours those who are lowballing their bids? And the good news is that there are actually lots of ways that they can do that. In fact, technology is also helping with this. And Margaret mentioned the question of culture and transparency. I think it's hard to rely on a code of practice because there will always be bad players. But where you have good methods for monitoring outcomes, then you can actually weed out people by results rather than a sort of preemptive code of practice. And you can actually do this very well now, where you can collect data on productivity per man-hour, the proportion of a construction that's done off-site using new methods, the actual energy efficiency performance of buildings once they're put up, feedback from the people who use the buildings, and then you can collect. And you can actually also monitor the entire construction process with automated sensors that will tell you if things are going wrong in real time. And all of this will lead you to a situation where you can judge companies by results. So you don't have to pick someone who has the relationship with the local authority or who is the default choice. And you don't get this overwhelming consolidation problem. You actually open up the market to new players who are using innovative techniques. But the problem we have at the moment with implementing this is there were several problems. The first is that our procurement in construction is extremely patchy. It relies on lots of different planning regimes effectively implemented in different ways by local authorities. They'll issue lots of different specifications for similar projects, which actively discourages the kind of investment in repeatable processes that we want to see. The second problem is short-termism. So instead of predictably tendering contracts so that companies can invest and say, well, we know that we will have a pipeline of customers for the next 5 or 10 years if we do this. There's all sorts of chopping and changing, so no one ever wants to invest. And the third problem is that the government often tenders massive projects, and it should be designing tenders in a way that it can actually bring together smaller companies and let them collaborate. So, for example, one contractor I spoke to today who actually has had a good experience with the Highways Agency, tendering involved an actual trial run in the field, bringing different contractors together and seeing how they work together, rather than having a confrontational process whereby you set the architect against the builder or whatever it is. So, I mean, these are all fairly specific to construction, but what they show is that when you have a system that overwhelmingly prioritizes low upfront numbers over value and innovation, you end up with a massively important industry that underlies the whole economy in a terrible situation, and that the role of government procurement in shaping that industry is absolutely massive and needs to reform itself in order to get progress.
Thanks very much, Julia. Dan?
Well, thank you. And so my name's Dan Lewis. I work for the Institute Directors. We've got 32,000 members. They're all individual. And it doesn't matter where I go in the country. There are always 3 complaints I get in very short order. The first is the broadband's terrible. The second is London gets too much money. And the third is that SMEs are getting crowded out, both in the public and private sector sphere, by bigger businesses. Certainly we welcome the government's intention to push 30% of procurement through to SMEs. But as 70% of our members are from SMEs, we think it could go an awful lot higher, as I'm sure you understand. So if we could just go back to the example of the super fast broadband contracts in 2010, 2011. What happened? There were some pre-requirements to take part in those contracts. One, you had to be in existence for 3 years. Second, you had to have public sector experience in contracts. Third, the councils actually had to sign non-disclosure agreements not to share cost information between other councils. And fourth, the contracts were so big, you really need to have tens of millions of pounds in the bank to go and bid for them. And so what actually happened, all 44 contracts were won by BT. And so if you want to know why your broadband speed is not quite as good as it should be, then I would suggest that the lack of competition for those broadband contracts has to be a prime example. And it wasn't just Fujitsu and Cable and Wireless who build off. It was all the alternative network providers, which are just now starting to come through and do really good work. But there are other examples as well. I've done quite a bit of work on the Smart Meters program, and Dame Margaret, I know, did a lot of work at the Public Accounts Committee, very good work on this, because it's the biggest infrastructure project you've probably never heard of. But I was really kind of amazed when there were SMEs out there who say, well, this doesn't need to cost £11 billion, we could do this for 2. But they could not actually get through. They just could not get into contention to do this, because what they had was an adaptive approach rather than a sort of top-down, one-size-fits-all, one type of meter, where they endlessly trying to agree with specification and they can't. But no, we had to sort of go on and keep doing this. In terms of PFI, the ID, we do support PFI. Yes, it was expensive, but I think it was very good at matching a much greater volume of projects and capital and investors than otherwise would have happened under the public sector. But I do think there was some information asymmetry. I do think that the people negotiating on the side of government were perhaps not as well informed and perhaps did not have as much skin in the game as the people on the other side. And I think some lessons could be learned there. But going forward, what are the solutions? You're not telling me that diversifying the number of suppliers from roughly 30 to 40 prime contractors has to be part of it, because I think it does. I really have my doubts that the government should put so much faith in subcontracting those contracts out to SMEs via these prime suppliers, because when you look at what's happened to the SMEs downstream in Carillion, they're blameless. They fulfilled their obligations. But I'm even told, and I'm not quite sure about this, but Carillion even had a 126-day payment system, which is twice the normal. And so they effectively had free cash flow, free cash from their SME down the supply base, helping fund them. We feel there's also a governance issue at stake, noted by in 2016, the relaxation of the clawback conditions for the bonuses. We think that sends out a very bad message about governance. But post-credit crisis, I think most people now accept that if a bank is too big to fail, it's too big. So maybe we need to start thinking in the same way about public sector contracts. If they're too big to fail, well, they're too large. So I would like to see a much greater participation by SMEs, and I do think we're only just sort of starting to scratch the surface about how to make sure that we can maybe start looking at insolvency insurance to address the fallout when this happens.
Thanks very much, Dan. Lots of thoughts there, which I've sort of tried to summarise. Concentration, transparency, bad behaviour going unpunished, lack of commercial skills in the civil service, which loads of MPs have told me about this, especially with defence projects which go on for years, and every time the Public Accounts Committee calls someone in front of them to talk about a specific project, it's always a different person who's in a 12-month posting, takes 6 months to get up to speed, and then is off 6 months later. Bad metrics, poor productivity in the construction sector, some of those statistics are extraordinary. Price being prioritised over value for money, impenetrable procurement processes for SMEs, and sort of too big to fail. And I want to just ask one question before I start opening up to the floor. About 10 years ago, there was a report into defence procurement by the Gray Report, which had exactly the opposite criticism of price versus value for money. Well, it was that everything was being ordered at too high a specification, gold plating, paying for a 100% solution when there was a 99% solution available for half the price. I mean, why has this been a sort of big sea change? And is that just because of the constraints on public spending, or has this sort of happened unwittingly?
The answer is I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I suspect there are two things. One is cuts in government spending have probably had a big impact on the approach, and undoubtedly there were probably inefficient contracts and negotiations that weren't being done very well, and some of that probably has improved as a result of cost pressures. But the other theory I would have about it is that defence is slightly different from other parts of procurement and is very much in the hands of with generals or soldiers who like big pieces of kit.
I wish I could agree that it improved. I think they did stop doing quite as much gold-plated stuff, and that was probably sensible. But they still change their mind all the time. They still move, so they change the specification all the time. They still cost run out of control. They're not tough enough at dealing with the private contractors. I mean, BAE, I remember, because I was an industry minister for a bit, and I think I can tell the story now. And at the time, the chief executive, whatever he was, the boss of BAE came in to see me, and he wanted some government money. And he basically sat in front of me and he said, "We want this extra £50 million, or we'll take our whole outfit to America." Now, BAE used to be, if you remember, a British nationally owned company. That's fine to put in the private sector, but come and do that sort of threat. I didn't listen to the threat, and they are sort of still here. But I think the ability, they obviously thought if they could come in and talk to politicians and just say to them, "Give us the money, or we're off in the global world somewhere else," they would do it. Can I just come back on PFI? And I'm being a bit provocative. I'll tell you, there's a report just out which I commend to you all, which is the National Audit Office has literally now in January just done another report on PFI. And there is a danger that ideology is informing that. And what that report demonstrates is that when the coalition government came in, they decided they were going to change how PFI was operating, very much along the lines that Juliet stated. Actually, nothing has changed. And there's a table in here which demonstrates that the ratio of equity to debt, which would be one of the ways of getting the pension funds in, just simply hasn't changed. The costs aren't any better. All those assertions that you sort of think on a common set, you can see why people think them, but the actual facts show that that's not the case. So I remain of this view that PFI, I mean, you do contract, doesn't mean the private sector doesn't deliver infrastructure programs. Of course they do. They always have and they always will. But using that private finance vehicle where you're borrowing today and paying tomorrow, I think just locks you into a lack of flexibility and too much cost. And I'll give you just one case study here, which has just shocked me when I read it. So in 2009, under the Labour government, the Highways England signed a 30-year contract to do the M25 expansion. They put an extra lane on. At the start of it, there were four companies that came in, who won the contract, four shareholders. Balfour Beatty, Scanser had a 40% stake, Atkins and Aegis had a 10% stake. At that time, they put in £200 million of their own money. £200 million. The rest was bank loans. Okay? They paid themselves an interest of 113 million, 200 million in. They paid themselves 113 million over a 5-year period, and they paid themselves dividends of 44 million. So they took back the money they put in within 5 years, and then in 16-17 they sold the whole thing on for £330 million, made a rotten great profit. Now there's something, and this was the new system. This was a lot under the new PS2, or whatever it's called, the new revised system. And you look at that and you think that is a terrible waste of taxpayers' money. And the other thing is we should not be saddling future generations with the debt from today. So for God's sake, let's get better at using the private sector and use all the modern methods. But this is a vehicle for investment I have come to feel totally opposed to.
In what I was more talking about, not the existing model, but a model that's quite widely used in Australia, whereby you don't borrow from the private sector necessarily to build the asset, but once you have built it, you privatise it to run the asset, and thereby you have a rolling sort of funding for your construction.
I don't know if you want to comment on
Well,
that.
I'll spare you more PFI. It's not an area that I have a massive expertise in, so I'll pass on that one. But I will mention a couple of things about the MOD, and actually it's the same in the NHS. When we were working, quite often we would be working on issues around how to improve procurement, and whenever we got the conversation that someone might die, so whether it's a soldier or whether it's someone who's receiving care, we knew the argument was over. There was no point in taking it further, and that's why MOD and quite often NHS, it's very difficult to impose a set of new rules or a set of normal commercial rules, because there will be, at that point, you just have to sort of like stop and go, okay, we can't progress this further. Now the problem is that sometimes people use that argument knowing full well that that's not the case. And they defend organisations from improvement by throwing up the defence that people will die. So it's a very, I think that in your example it is fairly specialist. What I would say is in terms of, and I think everyone on the panel has said this, if we know that a contract is going well and a good company is running it and good things are happening, we will reward that company and continue it. What happens too often is not only that we don't know whether a contract is going well, often we only find out when it's gone horribly wrong afterwards, but also that we don't actually allow ourselves to reject companies that are performing poorly. And I think there isn't any dogma about this. If you want a company to deliver a service and they come in and they say, I'm going to do it for 100 million, and they turn around within 6 weeks and go, I'm terribly sorry, senior civil servant, but it's going to cost 125 million because you didn't tell us about this. What they're doing is they're doing what they call land and expand. So win the business at the cheapest possible price you can, then come in 6 weeks later and start reconfiguring the specification in order to profit. Lower the bid to win, deliver to profit. And it happens all the time. And what we have a problem with is if you stand up to them at that point and say, right, we can't progress with this, we're going to go back out to tender. First of all, you end up with a court case. And the second thing is you're going to end up with another year plus of going through a tender. So once you've sorted out the court case, you've still got another year to get something done. At which point everyone rolls over and says, look, we'll give them the other 25 million because it's easier to have that go through. Now, if we knew that that was happening at the point that it was happening, day by day, week by week, we would soon expose the companies that adopt this practice, and we could price that into future tender negotiations and say, well, look, you've got a habit of adding 25% on everything. We're going to add that to your baseline price. And let's see how competitive you are then.
I open up to the floor for questions and please. If you just say who you are, where you're from, and questions as opposed to speeches, please. Gentlemen, there's microphones coming around, so.
I was very interested in what Ian said about...
So who are you, where are you from?
Oh, sorry,
I know you, but these
yeah. I'm Martin, I run a transport company, and earlier Margaret was saying, Dave Margaret was saying about some companies have 40% of their turnover is from private contract, or from public procurement. Mine is 95%, and the only 5% is because it's an architect company which is still giving out contracts from public sector, because public sector is the only place that our work comes from, so that, that's one of those things. But what he said about consolidation, I've seen it from both of us. I've seen it where we've had contracts we can't bid on because the starting point is you have to turn over £10 million a year, and we only turn over 2.3 million. But at the other point, we're seeing competitors being driven out because we're too big for them, and that's not our fault. We have contracts where there are thresholds on your quality, and you're only allowed to bid on certain contracts if your quality is that big. And a lot of the time, it's just because I've got more time to write framework submissions than they have. So we used to have something like 120 competitors. I went to a meeting a couple of years ago, and there were 6 people there, 6 companies who were able to bid on that contract. So it's the size of the contracts, and a lot of it, I think, is because of precaution. Exactly what you were saying about someone might die. You know, we deal with vulnerable adults and children transport services, and a lot of it is this. We have to have quality, and all of these other people are being frozen out of it. So how would you sort of tackle that? Yeah, we want to compete with the big guys, we want to compete with the little guys. We don't want people frozen out because of us, we don't want to be frozen out of other things. And what David Margaret said was we need more competition, and a lot of small companies being frozen out of that because of the precautionary principle.
So how do we open this process up to SMEs more?
Well, if you start, I think one of the easiest things to do is to start actually looking at what delivers competitive tenders. So if you have a market, whether it is, you know, home to school transport or home to hospital transport or whatever, I mean, if you see yourself going from 125 competitors to 6, you're doing something wrong. You know, these are the sorts of pieces of information that we should be looking at. The fact that we're dragging more and more money into fewer and fewer businesses at the top end is also a concern. So look at the way we procure and monitor it, and say, look, this is what works. I mean, it really doesn't help if you publish. We were bid on a tender recently. We had 10 days to respond, and we got 730 pages of densely typed contracts to respond to, and that included unlimited liability in there. You know, and you just have to hold your nose and sign and hope it's not going to be too bad. But and you know, luckily we've got through. But now they want certain financial guarantees on some contracts, and it's a real minefield. So simplify and really go and test what works. That's what I would say.
I think there is a principle really on 30% of contracts going through SMEs. They just don't enforce it. So you've got to actually, if you're serious about having SMEs, creating a market rather than destroying a market, you've got to actually enforce. That's one. So they've got to be serious about it. They're not. The second, I agree entirely about simplification of the document. We met a lot of SMEs who couldn't tender because of the cost of tendering. And you've said that because you've got the time to set around. So you've got to think about the cost of tendering and cut that. And the third one, and there is a difficulty in this, and I accept that, is I think how to localise much more so that you don't go for these big national contracts. And you really, the problem with that is your issue around construction companies. If you localise, then you've also got to ensure that you have the skills there available to fulfil those contracts. And there's a fourth point, and I've forgotten it, but those three will do. I mean, it will do for starters. I think that's all really.
Monitoring afterwards. Instead of pre-monitoring and saying we're going to make the precaution a set thing, and they're forgetting you can also monitor afterwards.
In the civil service, people of my generation went into the civil service to actually devise policy, and it's really fun, and a lot of MPs, just like thinking about new ideas, doesn't matter that implementing existing. It's all about devising policy. And I remember when I left university, you either went into almost at that stage, you went into academia or the civil service, and you spent your time thinking out, dreaming up about policy. It's completely wrong. And I think there's going to be a real radical reform of that. You know, you've got to. There are a lot of bright young things who go to the civil service, and they're neither trained, used, or rewarded in an appropriate way for modern government to ensure value money. So it's the training that gives them that. It's the valuing. Monitoring the contract is right down at the bottom of the value system in the civil service, and it shouldn't be. And then leaving people, I can't tell you enough about this, leaving people in a job to see it through. You know, at the moment, the way you rise in the civil services, you get a new job every couple of years. You're not doing that, you're not succeeding. What we should do is just change. It's not that difficult. You change the career and reward structure to meet your objectives, which are better value for money. And you should certainly the monitoring. I get really depressed because you do see these really bright young youths going in. It's not the recruiting dummies. We've got really clever young people going in there, and they just, the system drags them down into something where they're not really doing what they ought to be doing.
I mean, very briefly, what I just say, the old saying is no one got fired for buying IBM. But you see, this has to work both ways. So it's not just about government opening up more contracts to SMEs. It's really about creating a sort of culture where it's okay for civil service to take a risk, and they actually get rewarded for that.
Yeah.
Interesting. We've got a lot of questions, and we've probably got about started a bit late, so we'll finish a bit late. So I'm going to try and finish by 7:30, by 7:40. So I want to take two at a time because some of the panelists might not want to answer the question. Oh, one minute. I'll bump you down for that next time. I can have one from Chris Pole here, who's got a specific interest in the subject, and then the gentleman just behind him also.
Thank you, Alex. I'll just tell you a story. I spent 3 years working with government procurement, trying to get them to adopt a new form of getting working capital. The National Audit Office report of the 10th of January 17 said government procurement wasn't fit for purpose around commercial services. They reacted by going, John Manzoni went to the Treasury and said, we need another 200 analysts. They said, you can't get them. You've got to cut your budgets. He made that decision not to do direct procurement with SMEs anymore. I've got it in a letter. So my point is coming to that first of all, this is not just a procurement problem. It's a fundamental problem of the way in which the UK industry is structured and financed. Banks cut overdrafts. Without an overdraft facility, SMEs can't tender for working capital. They don't have the working capital, they won't pass the due diligence. Unless you look at the wider picture, one, the cash flow of working capital required. If I tell you that government average time between invoice issue and invoice approval is 74 days, they pay within 5 or 10. So it's structural. You can't just get SMEs procuring unless they can get working capital. Banks won't lend unless they've got security. Over 50% of new businesses don't have security and can't give personal guarantees. It's the same reason why 30% of our exports is produced in the UK in the supply chain. 70% come from abroad, which under bilateral trade deals will have a 40% premium. The problem is structural within the country. Yes, we've got procurement. You won't get SMEs until you start getting a new form of finance where people who don't have assets can get it for the contract. So if you're looking at how this happens, it comes down to working capital, but don't ignore the structure. And the structure, in 2010, the Bank of England report came out and said, buyer-driven receivable program. So my question is to the panel, how do you envisage getting cash flow so more businesses can actually tender? I'd like to ask the pool, how many people have a working capital problem and can't tender for contracts?
There's also journalists here and stuff as well who might know.
So it's structural. What is your view on the structural changes required? Sorry.
Thanks. And the gentleman just behind as well, if you just say where you're from as well.
Ian Nichols, I'm a retired construction bid manager. I work for Wimpy Construction. And well, as my memory's gone, but Dave Margaret is right, that it is cheaper for government to borrow money than the private sector. And I understand that the reason that they pushed effectively and other companies complained and there was a fine. You've got to get out of that ethos and try and get down to negotiation by an open book process. The only way it's going to work.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got two questions there. One sort of more about the finance, getting working capital and slow payments. And then procurement directives, fines, and also guilt being substantially cheaper. Who wants to come in on that, Dan? Either or?
Yes, of course, government borrowing is substantially cheaper. We've had hundreds of billions of quantitative easing. That's driven down the cost of yield. But I would still say that the volume of infrastructure through these PFI contracts that was actually built is far superior to if you left the pre-existing system in place and tried to do it all in-house. So I just think that has to be addressed. That really was what drove it in the first place.
I think you mentioned the EU rules. I want to be very clear about what I said. What I said was that the efficiency of tenders let outside of the EU rules, according to our data, is no better. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be improvements to the EU rules. I'm just saying that, and this is quite an important point here, is that actually the way we procure within government is it is something that continually adds weight. So every time you go through a contract, and this happens a lot in digital services, a mistake happens, so we end up adding something to the contract. We end up adding, and every time the procurements get bigger and bigger and bigger, which make it harder and harder for SMEs to bid on. So that was the point that I was making, that the inefficiency of public tendering. I don't know enough about the specific EU procurement rule that you were suggesting, but I do know that there is a facility to negotiate within the EU rules. Probably the chances are we're just not using it in the most efficient way. I don't know. On Chris, on your point around the structural issue around capital, around financing and access to finance, we do have, and I know from the work that we've done around SMEs that we do have issues with banks restricting lending and that limiting the capacity with which SMEs can grow into the contracts that are being let. But I would say that primarily from the evidence that we see around procurement is that it's less frequent that an SME is coming into a contract ready to, win it, and then just going, oh, I can't get there because of the stringent fiscal rules. It's much more common that an SME looks at the enormous pile of documentation that makes no sense to them and then just goes, I've got a job to do. I can't afford a full-time bid manager. And when I can afford a full-time bid manager, I'll get round to winning these contracts. And so there's a tension there. I do agree there are issues around capital investment and access to finance, but I think there is a lot more that government can be doing to make, we should be able to get small contracts through in no more time than it takes a teenager to get a date. I mean, it really, why does everything have to be like a marriage for government? With the divorce settlement already agreed before we even start, let's take some risks and start spending some money with some good companies.
I'm just going to, I mean, Chris has written to me about all this issue, and I just think what I get from all this is you need, you're absolutely right, it is largely procurement, but we need a more holistic approach. So you need to look at the process right from beginning to end, and if it's the way that invoices are handled and the way that payments are made and all that sort of stuff, you can just quite see that you need a more, and I take that point through. I've just got to say to Dan, I agree with Ian, and I don't agree with Dan. The reason we went down the this isn't about the private sector delivering infrastructure. They always have and they always will. It's whether you do it. You've got an amount of money, which is your budget, and you decide to put a certain amount into building hospitals, building schools, building roads. Or whether you say, I want to build 5 times as much, but I'm not going to pay for it today, I'm going to take it off my balance sheet and only pay a little bit today, and everybody else can pay tomorrow. And it's the use of that vehicle, not the use of the private sector in delivering contracts, that I think is just unsustainable. I think, as I've said, I've changed my mind on this. I was part of that Labour government that built those hospitals and schools, and I just think we should have had the guts, actually, maybe not the right place to say it in the taxpayers' allowance, but we should have probably had the guts at the time to say, okay, if you want all these new hospitals and schools, we'll raise the money through taxes to pay for them. We won't tell you we can do it within the existing area and saddle future generations. So it's not about the private sector involvement, it's about the vehicle use, and it's about saddling future generations and the inflexibility that the model leaves you with.
Yeah, I mean, our biggest criticism of this has always been that it is not particularly transparent and that it is, it doesn't show up in the numbers that the Chancellor says of the budget.
Yeah.
I think Juliet has a point on the SME finance, and then I'll take a few more questions.
Yes, one of the fallouts from the crisis is that new bank capital rules make SME financing much harder and standardise it so that banks actually can't assess the risk and extend credit to credit-worthy businesses, who might be bidding for government contracts. So that's one problem. But I do think that this will be gotten around by new types of lending, essentially. Whether it's peer-to-peer or new technological upstarts. You're shaking your head. You don't agree?
No, I don't.
Chat afterwards on that.
I think the banks are in for a big disruption.
Yeah,
coming
it
from
doesn't
quarters
work
like
because they
that.
need security for the risk. I set up the USM market, etc., the AIM market, right? It won't happen because they need security. There isn't the security that they do. They want the working capital when they sign the contract.
Okay, let's pick this up after, perhaps.
Pick it up. Yeah.
Cheers.
No
Right, I want 2 more. I want David Hammond there, and the gentleman with the glasses at the back.
Chairman,
Sorry, can I just ask, we've got a lot of questions, and we've got roughly, we've got roughly 15 to 20 minutes, so let's please try and get through as many as we can.
Just a couple of minutes. Dame Margaret called for more openness and transparency, and Dan was the first person and only person tonight to use the word governance. Now, Carillion is a prime example of lack of governance. And also the media have contributed to the hysteria at Carillion. 9 days ago, the Conservative Party, who I vote for, surprisingly, wheeled out minister after minister saying going concern. Now, going concern, for those who are not in finance, comes from the arcane world of accountancy, but it is very important because going concern is a statement saying this business is good for the next year. It wasn't good a year ago for the next year, and yet the directors did nothing to tell the world that it was going bust. Now, if audit committees are covering a company, the media, the auditors, why aren't the auditors called in immediately by the directors to rescind the going concern statement in their audit report a year ago. Now, governance should call for greater involvement by an audit committee, by the directors. If Carillion was quoted on the New York Stock Exchange, the SEC would have them in Rikers Island by now. And I'm not underestimating. There is total irresponsibility by a board where you're in breach of your covenants with your bank, you've negotiated an extension of your facilities with your bank, the banks are doing nothing because they don't want a huge write-off. This could have come out much, much earlier. And there is a need for proper governance rules to be imposed. Why isn't this London Stock Exchange listing agreement telling a company when you're in breach of your bank facilities, go public with it? If you had gone public with this, perhaps Carillion might have gone into administration, which would have saved many, many subcontractors, many, many businesses. Does the panel believe we need a new set of governance rules for public companies?
Okay, good question. Can you say that one, the gentleman at the back with the glasses, and then quickly, please.
Hi, my name is Guy Stroud. I spend my day job advising FTSE 100s at Procurement.
Okay.
Okay. So I would simply observe, take the FTSE 100, the same is true of the DAX, the same is true of the Fortune 500. Okay, for every pound they spend on their employees, they spend £5 on suppliers. Okay. And the public sector in the UK is competing with those FTSE 100s for the talent, procurement and vendor management talent. So probably the top of Dame Margaret, great book by the way. How are you going to get the injection of talent into the public sector when most of the people join the public sector, as far as I can see, didn't join because they wanted to be great commercial, do commercial voodoo to protect the public interest?
Okay, thanks. That's two points there. One on UK governance rules. Obviously, there's the auditors. I think are now being called in by well, I can't remember what the regulators are called, but looking at some of the financials of the company, it's quite interesting. There's obviously a lot of debt, some aggressive accounting, and profits versus cash generated is often very, very different, especially in these kind of outsourcing companies. So yeah, a question about governance and a question about how do you get the talent in the public sector, because we are talking about a lot of money here. Who wants to come in on that one first?
I think there is a question on accounting practices as to whether they actually reflect reality or not, because Tesco had the Tesco scandal also related to a similar issue, and so I think that in light of these scandals they need to look at what are the accounting practices and how close to reality are they.
A long way away.
I just want to, it's very interesting this. I the last year had my first non-executive directorship in that I chair a theatre. And we have run into financial trouble. And I sort of feel, we're sorting it out. But I sit there thinking, why didn't you? First of all, the executive committee didn't tell me the truth. It's just an interesting thing. The executive of just didn't tell me the truth. And the second thing is the auditors never really told me the truth. And it's the mixture of those two. It's the first time I've had to experience it. Means we've got into a far worse position than we might otherwise have done. We're going to get out of it. We're fine. So don't go think this thing's going to go bust. It's fine. But it's been a real learning experience for me. And in thinking about how this governance should work, and especially, I've never done a non-executive, maybe some of you in the room have done it. It's very difficult to get that balance right between not getting involved and interfering in day-to-day running, which you're not there to do, but yet ensuring that you have the proper, and you're dependent on the data. So we were dependent on getting the full information from our executive, and certainly the auditors, what on earth they were doing in this instance and not telling us. But, you know, as you're trying to struggle your way out of it, the last thing you want to do is upset the auditors. I mean, that's, you know, that's the reality of where you are. On the injection of talent, people come into the public's, you know, into the civil service in part because they have that public service ethos. And that's really what draws. Otherwise, people might choose to work elsewhere. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things I always say about the work I did in the Public Accounts Committee, it's not the sort of work a lot of politicians do. They do focus on new ideas. But actually doing that work resonated so much more, not just with the Taxpayers Alliance, but actually with my constituents, with everybody. Because people care, they give up their hard-won earnings to the government to spend on their behalf. They care that it should be very well spent. So I think it's at the heart of what anybody working in the public sector should care about and focus on. And if we built that as part of the public service ethos, and I think most of those young civil servants who come in share that, having, it's not that difficult to train them. We train them in other ways. We can just train them to do those financial, commercial, IT, project management, whatever, those sort of skills that they need. And then we have to value it. And some of you are shaking your heads. I don't think it's that difficult. I think we could do it, and I think they would get they get as much satisfaction there out of actually ensuring that the services work for the public as they do about dreaming yet another initiative for sorting out inner cities, which will probably be changed within 6 months.
I'll answer both questions very quickly, if I may. Firstly, I think on the accounting practice, there's a particularly troublesome activity, which is paying down dividends against future earnings. If you're going to do that, you should be subjected to far more scrutiny as a company. I know that doesn't solve all the problems, and there are a lot of them, but I mean, I think in a lot of that goes a long way to making people more. Well, okay. I mean, under the current arrangement, Carillion was able to pay down dividends even though they didn't have all of the cash against those dividends. So we should be looking at that. On the second matter of engaging commercial staff in civil service, it's a mix of things. So there's no one sort of easy answer. What I would say is, and I've been banging the drum for transparency all evening, is that actually, if you're going to be much more transparent about your contracting, then actually it becomes pretty quickly aware internally when contracts are going wrong and whether or not somebody is able to manage contracts. So that's one thing that transparency would deliver. I'm not adverse to exploring how successful management of contracts delivers reward both personally and collectively to civil servants. And I think we ought to be thinking in some of those ways. I know that there is the public service is a draw for many people, and that the good of public service is a good thing. But if we are seeing good work done, why shouldn't people be rewarded for it? Now, I know that that's a very complex area. I would just say it's something to consider.
Okay, yeah, on the dividends, it is interesting. I mean, the dividend cover for the last 3 financial years is 1.9 for Carillion, which compares to a FTSE 100 average of 1.63. So on paper, it looked all right, but the declared profits weren't the same as the cash being generated. So probably not time for one more. There's a gentleman just here with the glasses and the gentleman standing at the side there. And I'll take one more from the front row here, and then I'm afraid we're just going to have to knock it on the head.
Thank you very much. My name's Alan Fox. I used to be cabinet member, executive member on Cornwall Council. I'd like to start off by thanking very much Dame Margaret for apologising for voting for PFI for hospitals as the opposition party researcher for public health back in 1997 when this was the first bill put forward by the Labour government. It's good to hear that you think it was wrong. It's a shame that you and Jeremy Corbyn thought it was right at the time. Going back to Cornwall, I was the procurement, the cabinet member in charge of procurement at a time when we were trying to let homeschool transport. And we would let these big contracts, and it meant that these big consortia, these big companies would bid for them. And it meant that the companies would be based, and sorry for those people who don't understand Cornish geography, but it's very spread out. And you would get a company that was basically bothering 20 miles to drive to university, to drive something 2 miles to school. And it was understandably incredibly expensive. And what we did was say, we can't do this. We have to go for what will end up with the cheapest contract. How can we structure a contract that will end up with the results? And that's what we did. And yes, you need to break down these contracts. Yes, you need to have safeguards. But you also need to have a little bit of brain power within either the civil service,
to see their environmental policy, to see their environmental statement, to see their all the due diligence about their business continuity planning, business disaster planning. Would it be right and proper, and would government look at, when letting large contracts, speak to the trustees of the pension fund to find out what's going on? Because it's been reported in the Financial Times today that Carillion left a £500 million at least black hole in the pension fund. That's the scariest thing for most people. And it's also a worry that the trustees were warning Carillion's board of the scale of the pensions black hole for a number of years while still paying massive dividends. So just would the panel comment on that, please?
Okay, one final question. No, sorry, we're out of time.
Hi. My name is Ajit Chambers. I made a company to open the disused tube stations under London to deliver £4 billion to the taxpayer by renting disused underground stations. We've been through a procurement process with Transport for London. I'm now suing them for £200 million. My question is very simple. How do we get government to control the procurement process? And I know there are a lot of details in the room at the moment, but how do we get the government to do their jobs, which is stop procurement fraud?
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, just on the pensions is an interesting one, and this is an issue that I think is going to come up a lot, because a lot of these legacy schemes are, frankly, complete toast. But I do find it a little bit rich when, no offence to Dave Margery here, politicians talking about the holes in these pension schemes, when the NHS pension scheme's got a deficit of more than all of private sector schemes combined, because there are no assets, because it's an unfunded pension scheme. So not to detract from what's obviously a very big issue. So I'll go from down across, and we've got roughly a minute each. So we're trying to deal with all of that.
I think I'll pass, actually. And
Okay.
pass on.
Yeah, I think there is a worry with pensions. I mean, the PPF is taking over this pension, but if there's more of this to come, will the PPF be able to cope? Because this isn't going to be the first. But there's also a problem of pension deficits right now are particularly bad because of the state of interest rates, and it's very hard to work out. Should you? You're not allowed to treat that as a temporary problem, which is probably right, and yet you are allowed to sort of suspend payments into your pension and continue to pay dividends. So I think there's clearly something wrong with the rules as to where the pensioners come in the hierarchy. As to the gentleman talking about council contracting, I think that it's great. There are definitely pockets of sophistication in public procurement, or just things being done well. But these practices don't get shared, and everyone redoes their own process every time and thinks that they need it to be bespoke. So, if there were a better way for this information to be gathered together and shared, I think that would be good.
I'm really pleased that the Cornwall councillor, I'm sure he too has done things in the past where he's changed his mind. If he hasn't, I'd be absolutely amazed. But it's really important during a lifetime of public service that you admit that you don't get everything right first time. And I hope that he too has got learned lessons from what he's done in his past.
Hashtag me too.
Hashtag me too. That's absolutely right. And just the one point I made about pensions, just don't put. I wonder if the onus should be on the procurement authority. I'd be interested to see what Ian thinks. I think there ought to be other ways. If you're doing the procurement, we're asking for far too much information. We want to ask for less. You do some financial due diligence, but I think it's the board, it's the finance director, it's the auditors, it's the financial regulation authorities. Those are the people who should be ensuring that there is sufficient money left in the pension pot to meet the liabilities. I'm not sure it ought to become part of the procurement process. I don't know what Ian thinks.
I think
We just don't want the taxpayer footing the bill.
I think that the issue is, if you land everything on the plate of procurement, if procurement has this job of preventing every poor eventuality, you end up going in the wrong direction. And the wrong direction is bigger contracts with lower tolerance of risk. So actually, the bigger the contract is, the lower the tolerance of risk is. But actually, that's more likely to go wrong. So the bigger the contract is, the more likely failure is to follow it. So part of the problem is saying some of this is going to go wrong, but we're going to allow it to go wrong because it's small. And some of the other parts of this is around saying we want healthy companies and we want good companies, and that's about the pensions regulator looking into that and making sure that they understand the exposure of different large companies. If you land everything up the front door of procurement, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think we have to resist that urge. And I made the analogy of going on dates. I mean, it really is that sort of thing. You know, not every time government goes out to spend money should they be looking for a partner for life. And I think that comes back to the point of how do we get value for money, which is actually, let's take a scientific evidence-based approach. Let's test some ideas, see what works. Oh, well, that works better. We've got good evidence that saves money in a rural economy. Let's use that approach. And finally, on the matter of procurement fraud, I think, and I cannot stress this enough, I am aware of the possibility that so whether or not something's fraud, I think is a very, very high bar to set. I think if you talk to the Serious Fraud Office, what happens in most of our procurement that we would consider to be unseemly is not fraud. So just put that into context. What I consider to be anti-competitive behaviour and unethical is remarkably common in my view. And I think that the best way to counter that is to make those who are responsible for overspending make that information available to people so you can monitor the history of particularly suppliers but also buyers who let uncompetitive tenders. And we can start to see what is happening. If you look at what's happened in Ukraine following the revolution, they put in a system called ProZorro, that every public sector tender is completely open. Every supplier's bid is open, all their pricing is open, and all the specification is open. Guess what's happened? There's a lot less fraud. And I think unless we're prepared to be, bold and do the sort of things that Slovakia and other countries are doing, we aren't going to get the insight that we really need to know whether or not we're being efficient with the spending and the way we spend money.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, we're going to have to call it a day there. But I'm glad that we've settled this issue once and for all. Thanks to everyone for coming, but especially thanks to the panel who've given up their free time to be here. So
Hello.